I call it, my I have to work in the morning test. Like, okay, you could, be it Moldbug or Lenin or whoever, these revolutionary politics. Like, okay, that all sounds great, but I have to work in the morning. How is this actually going to affect my real life and the people around me?
My guest today is Prester John Andrews. He is a writer on Substack and a podcast host. And today we speak about the modern malaise that is to be the bugman, to consume the bugs, to live in the pod, to extract all of your intellectual nourishment from the screen. And in addition to that, we also speak about the shifting quicksand that is modern masculinity, being trapped between a heroism that you don't get to live and the unsexy realities of finding heroism in everyday life. We also speak a bit about politics, about the upcoming regime change in the US and the strange coalitions that have formed behind the Republican Party and our common hope that things turn out well. If you enjoy this podcast and if you like this production, please do consider becoming a member of the community on Substack. You can find that at alexkashuta.com. You will get the archive of everything I've ever produced, including the community on Substack. We enjoy it there. It's wonderful. Please do also consider becoming a member on Patreon, where you get the audio of every podcast ever made. And if you like this video, if you're seeing it in video form, please do like, subscribe, interact positively with this content because it helps. Thank you and enjoy my chat with Prester John Andrews. So you have a lot of interesting work, especially kind of in the universe of modern masculinity, or what it is to be a man, what it is to be online in the year of our Lord 2025. And what one of your pieces that kind of struck me, because even as a woman, I do kind of see myself in this, was your piece about being the bugman or avoiding being the bugman, the possibility of avoiding being the bugman. Like this is kind of a meme online. The bugman is he eats the bugs, he lives in the pod, he consumes the soy goy slop, whatever it is. And he just kind of goes through the motions of consumerism and is just essentially kind of an object to the machine that surrounds him. He's been catered to by all the conveniences, and there's kind of no way of escaping this. And to me, it really feels like the bugman existence is, for most people, a bit of a revealed preference. We chafe against it, but also at all the forks in the road where people can choose, like really uncomfortable, kind of the jagged edges of life, people tend to go back to the pod. They tend to eat the slop. So I wonder, what's your tension with this? Because being online, and obviously you are online, you're on Substack and you write and you engage with people online, and I don't know if you consider yourself very online, but once you're online, once you know about the Bugman meme, you're kind of, in the Bugman universe in a way, just by the fact that, you're plugged in. So how comfortable do you feel in this universe? What chafes? What is okay?
Yeah. So just first of all, once again, thanks again for having me on. This is a big pleasure to be on there. But to answer your question, believe it or not, other than Substack, I'm not particularly online. I'm kind of in a weird space where I work in the tech world and I do it for a living. But I wasn't one of those people, like, you always talk about, like, people who are very tech native. Up until about 6 years ago, I worked as like a chef, or before that I was in more traditional blue collar jobs, like I would work in factories or retail or stuff like that. So it's kind of a weird thing where I'm a little bit inside of it, a little bit outside of it. And I hadn't been, like, I was a very online digital native. I got online probably way before I should have, at like 12 or 13 years old. And then kind of more and more started to distance myself from it, since I really, there was a time where, like, I was very into, like, the people like Ray Kurzweil, or, like, the techno-optimist, futurist, transhumanist types. Because at the time I was coming up, it felt very, it felt like a realistic and attainable thing, that techno-optimist thing. But weirdly enough, like, the more people got into it, and the more we started to see social media become more prevalent, the online space has really changed, and the more I wanted to pull back from it. And probably like, I used to be on, old forums and stuff, but I never used Twitter. Again, believe it or not, I was never a Twitter guy. I just more and more pulled back from it, and then I got back online with Substack. And yet, in a roundabout way of answering your question, it's sometimes feels like it's a difficult line to walk, because on one level, the to be the Bugman is, and one way, like, it comes from a place of great privilege if you can just kind of check out and stop participating in society. But on the other hand, it's almost like a suicidal death drive thing. I've known lots of people who, like me at the time back then, were very techno optimist. But when you attach your self worth and your well being to something like that, like so many people I know like that have just become like, almost suicidal in their ideation, the way that they interact with the world. So, but at the same time, it's something that I do for a living. And also, like, I wouldn't be having conversations like this if you don't exist in these spaces. So one of my main things is, with my writing and my life in general, trying to find a good halfway point between modernity and tradition, and being able to exist in these spaces, but not have, not have that be your core value and your core way of viewing the world, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think that's pretty much the challenge for our generation, to figure out if there is a middle way. I mean, the problem you have with online is that it's not very conducive to having nuanced discussions, because just it is tribal in nature. People essentially want to know who's on our team, who's on the opposite team, and then you kind of have this cross polarization where everyone's just reacting to everyone else's rage slop, and it just escalates from there, and everyone's kind of entrenching their position more and more and going more and more extreme. And yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I think for me, having gone through the cycle, I I kind of, I'm trying to do things, in a more moderate way, but what I'm finding is just that there's not really an audience for this. Um, Unfortunately, yeah, it's maybe maybe because there's not any clear cut solution. It's not like, okay, we just have to deport X people, this is the list, or shoot this, percentage of the population and things will go back to normal. But yeah, it's a tough line to follow. And I like your approach, and I like the kind of the measured way. And also I like that, you're someone who's come from the left, or kind of has been in kind of left-wing spaces, has become more moderate. I don't even know if moderate is the word, or, you're someone obviously with a high degree of openness, and who who's trying to look at things as they come to you, rather than inhabiting whatever lens is put in front of you, and is kind of force fed to you by the people on your side. So yeah, I wonder what you make about what the internet has been, and what it's become in your lifetime, as someone who used to be very online, maybe had a little hiatus in the real world, and now you're back.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that you say that, because on one level, like, because when I first started writing, you were one of the people I followed, or people like Matt Taibbi, and like the moniker that was really popular at the time is being heterodox. And I think already that's kind of, it can be kind of its own cringe thing. Where I kind of, say it's the I'm not like the other girls of political ideologies. But I came at it because, like you said, I was somebody who was nominally a lot more on the left. Some of my seminal and like very influential things in my life politically were something like the Occupy Wall Street movement in the U.S., and later on the DSA. And with stuff like that, I was never totally bought in on the tribalism side. I'm somebody who came from, it's sometimes called like the Blue Dog Democrats, like Union Democrats in the Midwest. And I had, pretty specific goals that I wanted to accomplish as far as, my political goals, like, stuff like American labor, or, being against the Iraq War. And I saw over the years, and this is, obviously not unique to me, but the things that were most important to me kept on getting sidelined. And it was because of, to me, it seemed like, this desire to be tribalistic, like you're giving up on things that were important just because, the other side says it's bad. Like I remember, I forget if it was I think it was the 2020 US election cycles, and Bernie Sanders going on the Joe Rogan Experience. And there was just so much vitriol against it. Like, say what you will about Joe Rogan, Bernie Sanders, what have you. But to me, I was like, oh, that's great. We have more working class people on our side. And, you see 2020 Joe Rogan endorsing Bernie Sanders versus 2024 Joe Rogan endorsing Donald Trump. I think that a lot of people went through that transformation. And it's very easy to get caught up in your side, but I tried to be a little bit more measured in it because I was not necessarily, woke, whatever you want to call it, but I was very, very tribalistic. I wasn't willing to even listen to the framing devices from people who were more on the right. And then I saw, basically the left as it exists in the United States, which I don't really think it has existed for a while. But, maybe that's something farther down in the conversation to discuss. But I saw, everything that we were shooting for and everything actually working for get kind of subverted. And that's when I started becoming a little bit more open to thinking of things in a different framing. Like your show was one of the, the catalyst actually, listening to somebody like Curtis Yarvin and, a funny story about that I can say later. But yeah, getting very tribalistic, now it feels like once you've gone through that rigmarole, you have to be a little bit more open-minded in the way that you see things. And that's what I try to do. And, somebody like Curtis Yarvin is somebody who I find interesting and a great way to look at the world. But, I also haven't given up on, I think like somebody like Noam Chomsky also still has a lot of great stuff to say.
Yeah. Insert funny Yarvin story here.
So
Curious.
my funny Yarvin story is, I kind of wrote about my years in the wilderness being like, a DSA person and trying to, volunteer for labor rights. And then when Bernie Sanders lost in 2020, it was definitely a come to Jesus moment for me. I just kind of basically stopped participating in volunteer work and some of those online spaces. I just remembered seeing this meme of like, I don't know did you ever see, there's like a genre of like political compass memes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And somebody said, they were a monarchist. And I remember like, this is a troll. Nobody's actually a monarchist. And then I started looking into it and I was like, oh, wow, this is like an actual intellectual pursuit. And I was like watching a YouTube video by Curtis Yarvin. And like the title was, why America should be a monarchy. And my wife walked in on me and like, she's like, the look on your face, you look like I caught you watching porn or something, just because like being anti-democracy, like, that's one of his things that's just so antithetical to everything that the left believed at the time. So it was a funny story.
Yeah, I mean, I think Curtis Yarvin was an awakening for a lot of people, and you're obviously not the only person who's left the DSA. There's essentially kind of a whole movement of the ex-Bernie bros, right-wing convert faction. Yeah, it's a thing, and what my hope is that I think being on the internet for so long, and I kind of came up through the my first very online movement that I was part of, and obviously looking back pretty cringe way, was New Atheism, which was kind of a big thing online. I was like a forum admin, and I was making memes, and I was it's like late teens, early 20s type situation.
Yeah, me too.
Very into the Four Horsemen. I watched every bit of media that was out there with the Four Horsemen of the New Atheist, religion apocalypse. And I went through that, and then obviously this whole wave kind of, I don't know if it was started by Jordan Peterson, but I found Moldbug and Jordan Peterson kind of at the same time. And Jordan Peterson kind of made me cringe less at things that I was very resistant to because of New Atheism, like, I don't know, the symbolic interpretation of the Bible, whatever, Jungian, perspectives and stuff. And then I was kind of, my degree of openness was ready to imbibe straight from the source, from unqualified reservations. And yeah, that was kind of where I started with this. But having gone through all of this and just observing myself getting lost in these movements, and just my MO is just I go in there and I just read everything I can find. I just get captivated by whatever train of thought of one person, and then I read the literature they recommend, and I have a whole bookshelf of the books that Moldbug recommends throughout the ages, and I've seen the Dr. Seuss movie, and all the stuff
Oh
that he
yeah.
references. So yeah, it's you absorb this stuff, and then you kind of process it, and then you come out the other side, and then there's another thing and another thing, and it's you start to observe it affecting you, and how you go through the ringer. Because I think for someone like me, I'm whatever, a seeker archetype. I'm always trying to find the idea that will solve my understanding of the world, that's going to put the puzzle together. But every time I come out of the trough of like, now I'm absorbing the stuff, I come out and I'm just like not much wiser. I feel I know much more, but the cornerstone, the key piece is always missing. And I don't know, after a while the whole process becomes a little bit dubious. I don't know if this is like some sort of Zen insight that I've stumbled upon, like the fact that the more you sweep the floor, the less sweeping exists, or something like this.
Right, right.
I don't know, it's just going through the motions of this, and it's kind of a cringe thing, to just be like, obviously this tells you that I've been very online for a very long time. But yeah, I do hope a lot more people will go through this process, especially a lot more people who are kind of intellectually curious, and will come out through these peaks and troughs, and hopefully a bit more wise and a bit more robust to the effects of this black hole absorption into something. Because a lot of people just stay there. I know, a lot of people still love new atheism. A lot of people, are very deep in the trough and it's very comfortable in there. But I do hope, like, our exposure to the internet, to ideology, to information like this, that it does kind of produce a class of kind of wizened people at the end, where, just our ability to interact with information transforms in a way where it's not suspicion or anything. It's just understanding, okay, it's very easy. All of this stuff is very selected. You go into the forums, it's a X forum. It's a type of forum that, where people who believe a certain thing congregate, and they argue, they cherry pick, they do everything they can to push you into the direction that, the ideology of the forum has. So I think, yeah, I mean, that's my hope, What do you think? Will there be a generation of people who've been so battered by the internet that they have to find the third way?
I mean, it's an interesting question for sure, and I think we're already starting to see, well, just from my anecdotal interactions, that Gen Z is already maybe starting to move away from that. Like, it's kind of cringe, like, millennial coded behavior to be terminally online. Because I mean, I'm kind of in the same boat as you, like, especially as somebody who is very intellectually curious. Because again, a lot of my, I don't want to say political awakening, because I like to joke I've been insufferable from a young age, like kind of like you're talking about, like being into the new atheism stuff, or like reading books about like the financial crisis as it happened, and I was like 16, 17, probably not even understanding it. But you wonder, like, how much of this is actually productive. Because if you want to look at political movements throughout history that have been successful, the Theorycels are very rarely the ones who actually make the changes. Because one of my favorite anecdotes ever is, I was reading a book called The People's Tragedy. I forget who the guy who wrote it, but it's talking about the Russian Revolution, and about 20, 30 years before the initial revolution, you saw there was this phenomenon of like second and third sons who would go into the Russian countryside, who would read Marx and like, we're going to radicalize the proletariat. And they would teach them to read. But for the most part, the proletariat weren't super interested in that. They didn't want to read Marx. Once they could read, they only read books about agriculture or, light entertainment, basically. So, you can theory sell all day and read everything. But at the end of the day, like actual meaningful political change um, happens for a complex combination of reasons, really. But at the same time, like you do need something to shape those moments when it happens. Like, somebody like Lenin or even, Franco, if you want to look at the left or right poles of it, they were able to give some sort of ideological framing to a moment where there's chaos happening. And that's where I do see the other side of it, right? Because if you look at the difference between 2016 Trump and 2016 Trump when he took office, I guess technically 2017, and the 2025, and seeing people like Mark Andreessen or Elon Musk, or if you've heard the term like the PayPal mafia, these tech guys, it seems like Moldbug or Nick Land or some of these people, it's an ideological framing for what were really, I guess you could say, their material conditions if you're going to use the more Marxist framing. But so all that to say, like I always try to find things that are actually going to be helpful to understand the world and take things as they come. That's why I say, like, again, like two of the most influential books in my life for understanding the world would be Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, and then also James Burnham's The Managerial Revolution. I think they both provide really important insight into understanding the world and not getting too caught up in being in an ideological ghetto.
Yeah, I think Burnham was probably one of the first people the first people that we know of and has written about it, and is kind of, relatively famous, who's been through the peaks and troughs. And essentially kind of the managerial revolution was him trying to describe it on a more mechanistic level. Okay, like, okay, this is the you know the very pragmatist perspective on how power works. I think that's also, in large part why Molbug is so interesting and famous. And he has quite powerful predictive strength. But it's interesting now that, obviously everyone's excited for Trump on the right, but in a way, if Trump succeeds, Moldbug is discredited, because Trump, whatever, you want to say about his new, he is acting a little bit more authoritarian than his framing generally would allow, but he's not the Caesar. He's not the Caesar figure. If DEI goes away, we're essentially kind of in the Rufo Reich, which is a different type of situation than Moldbug predicts. Or maybe Moldbug is like the Bene Gesserit, and he his thinking spans centuries, and there are plans and plans, and this is just the first step in that direction. That could be as well. But yeah, it's interesting to see. And I think one thing about analyzing the world that we currently live in from a historical perspective, and I see a lot of people doing this, and from that perspective, we're on the brink of civil war. We have been for a long time, but I think people really underestimate the power that comes with technology and how transformational technology has been, just in terms of how powerful the incentives for globalization are, how much people want to not only move to the West, that's one thing, but be like the West. The West is an empire, or American, more precisely, is an empire the world has never seen before because of technology, and because most media comes out of the US. I mean, there's a lot of media in China, I understand, but even the Chinese want more Western media. We want more Western media. Everyone in the world wants to be going in that direction. So, the fact that the West sets the tone, I think, changes the chessboard quite significantly. And a lot of politics, even politics in Romania, is very much downstream from what's going on in the West. Like, we had a crazy upheaval recently in Romanian politics. We had presidential elections. We had this guy who's essentially kind of a, dime store RFK type figure, who essentially won the first. We have a system where you have kind of a primary, everyone votes, and then you have finalists, and then you have, the first round and the second round, and then the finalists duke it out in the second round. But he won the primary. He was the top candidate by votes, by everything, by far. and they canceled the election, obviously because Romania is in the fiefdom of the European Union, and they thought that because the guy was really promoted on TikTok in a very short span of time, like no one had heard of him like 3 months before the election, and then there was this like massive, intense TikTok campaign, and obviously Russian interference. Obviously, the guy is got Russian friendliness, and obviously the EU doesn't like that, so we're kind of you know strangely in limbo now because we've canceled the elections. I don't exactly know when the new elections will happen. The current president has quit. Now we have a kind of interim president. Yeah, it's all crazy. But like I'm saying, this candidate is essentially Romanian RFK. Adjust for IQ. That's pretty much what you see. And it's really interesting because it's all modeled on a pattern, and the pattern comes from a central location disseminated by mass media. So, how that affects geopolitics, it's we shall see.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting that you said that, and it's something that I've been thinking about, and I've been, reserving judgment because, as of recording this, we're only a couple weeks into the next Trump administration, and also, to the degree that, I always use the old Dan Carlin line, like, I'm not a historian, I'm just a fan of history. But seeing how these things typically shake down, if you want to see America in late Empire era, or if we're in late Republic, but it is something that I became more aware of as I got older, like especially listening to your podcast and how you would talk about, for example, there being Black Lives Matter protests in Romania when there's not even a significant amount of, a Black population. And that's when, you think about America as an empire and what we're exporting. And the whole thing since, they call it the post-war consensus, since World War II, it's been, we're protecting democracy, right? But when you see, for example, you were talking about in Romania, elections getting canceled or that happening in Ukraine, and that's leftist criticism that I think is really pretty valid, that you see, historically what the United States has done in like Latin America or the Middle East of, subverting democratic norms. I feel like we've kind of run out of credit that we had after World War II for being the ones who, quote unquote, spread democracy, make the world safe for democracy. So again, that's when I think about what really Mulbug and some of the people that he mentions, like Machiavelli, Burnham, etc., talking about elite theory. You see that a certain model for American empire really isn't working anymore, and it feels like people aren't buying it. So the degree to which Trump is going to be successful, and if this is going to be a new era and we're pulling back, it's still too early to tell, right? Because that's something I see. I have friends on the right who are very triumphalist right now, and I understand where it's coming from because, Trump is making some pretty significant systematic changes. That having been said, I saw this exact same thing happen basically in, when Obama was elected and he made really sweeping systematic changes that we're only just now really starting to see the nuts and bolts of. And it kind of subverted and neutered the left. We'll see if that's actually the case because, I'm not a political scientist or theorist, but just by my estimate, like Trump would need to be extremely successful, not only politically, but make things better for Americans materially. And there would have to be one, if not two Republican presidents after this for it to like really make these changes take hold. So it just feels like we're at such a precipice of how things are changing politically and socially that, it's kind of impossible to make calls at this point,
Yeah, I think one thing that is interesting and hopeful in this, and also especially if you take into consideration this lens of elite theory, is that you can tell that America is also the training ground culturally for the world's elites. So whatever the pattern that's going to emerge as good politics, as profitable, as sharing the wealth, trickle down, whatever. If something is robust and functional in the U.S., people will try to copy it. I mean, they've tried to copy neoliberalism with varying results. Partly if you look at Russia, it also depends what material you're working with. So the oligarchic class after communism wasn't necessarily the best material to work with. But yeah, I think that's a hopeful thing. Obviously, the problem with a super triumphalist right, and I've been talking about this here in the past as well, is that overplaying your hand is very possible. Like really stretching the ban into directions that are repulsive to people will create, as it has for the left, a kind of festering movement within the Republican Party that is going to create its own backlash. Like if the Republicans can actually provide what they promised, to secure the border, to improve living conditions, to bring back jobs, whatever, through the art of the deal or whatever Trump's trying to implement. I think that will be excellent, and that could be the basis for this new mold that a whole generations of elites might be cast in the world. Or we're going to get crazy backlash from the left, and we're going to continue in this negative polarization spiral. I hope that's not going to happen, because my intuitions and my instincts are very much favoring a more right-wing situation globally. But I think it's a serious danger that I think people, because of the enthusiasm, and I get it, it's fun, and these elections essentially have been won on the backs of memes and posters and all this type of stuff. But eventually, when it comes down to realpolitik, if you're not actually going to deliver the results, and if a great number of people in your faction that no enemies to the right, I get it, are want to gas the Jews or something like that, it might come back to bite you in the ass. I don't know. It just seems like a potential issue.
Yeah, it feels like sometimes people have very short memories. Um, and which again I understand, because like it is fun to dunk on libs. I'll give everybody that. But I think the reason why Trump and like the more, I guess, right populist moment that we're seeing across the world is having purchase is because, kind of like you said, the that old elite is just, it's not even a high status thing anymore. And, the super progressive, woke, whatever term you want to use, it definitely overplayed its hand, and you're seeing knock on bad material effects. But it's also easy to forget that those positions didn't come from nowhere. And I think that was reacting against something that was real. And for the most part, like, I know the people that I talk to, like, can be a lot more heterodox. And, there's very, very few people who want to go back to, like, a straight up, like, say, in the US, complete ban of abortion or some things like that, like you said, you could totally overplay your hand, and we could go back and forth between these two poles. And, if I were a very cynical person, I would say, wow, that would be kind of the ideal conditions if you would want to have, essentially chaos forever. And that's a great way for, unscrupulous oligarchs who don't actually have an ideology or a vision to kind of maintain control.
Yeah, I mean that's essentially what's the normal pattern here in these parts. Things have been, Romania has actually been improving quite a lot in terms of that, in terms of corruptions. We have our oligarchs and all that, but it's morphing towards more of kind of a Western mode of oligarchy. Like there is some competence behind these oligarchs. Like they actually do produce goods and services. They get government contracts when maybe there would be someone better to do it. But the thing is, they're so large that, and they have economies of scale where you're like, actually pretty much, yeah, they win the tenders for real. So yeah, it's it's a strange place, but there has been quite a lot of improvement. And strangely, the guy who was mayor in my region, who essentially lifted this region up from, it looked like the backwoods of Chernobyl, like maybe 30 years ago. And now now we have American tourists coming through and taking pictures. So it's actually, it's changed for the better, 10x in the last, few decades. So it's yeah, I think, and this is, essentially, strangely, I think a bit of European neoliberalism has actually done wonders here, and also a bit of European money, quite a lot of European money, which, it's a mixed bag. But yeah, it's it is strange because, kind of like the EU. The EU has its problem from inception was that it was trying to bring together not only heterogeneous cultures, because Europe is very heterogeneous, but very much heterogeneous economies. You had issues, like in Greece and Italy, essentially tanked the economy by trying to apply a German mold to how you should handle it. But essentially, the whole system, the whole intricate system by how things were actually getting somehow done had to be scrapped, and then you apply this strange alien model, and it just does not work, and a strange alien currency especially that also does not work. So yeah, for Romania, the way they approached it has been, yeah, it's been pretty horrendous for a lot of local industry, but it's also been really good for a lot of people. So yeah, it is interesting how, because all of these countries are so different, these systems more or less work or not. Like I said, in the case of Greece, yeah, it's yeah, it's a strange place to be. Like I'm not necessarily very pro EU, but it's been good to me.
Yeah, it and that's kind of the thing I keep on coming to. Like it's sometimes it feels very difficult if you're the type of person who wants to have political takes right now because things change so rapidly. I've recently had a situation where I started to write an article, but then things changed while I was writing. It just kind of made it irrelevant. But I think that's one trend that I see that I think is a good direction that, again, I would say, I'm less ideological and more results driven. And you could get somebody like me, if say, the MAGA project went forward more being, for example, the US being more isolationist and like letting the EU and, Romania, all these different countries kind of have their own sphere of influence, moving towards a multipolar world. Somebody like Alexander Dugin writes about that. To me, for it will definitely be a difficult transition, but it feels like the neoliberal model has just kind of run out of steam, just because it kind of, more than anything, like you mentioned, it's on a material level, it's working for some people, but it's also it's not a universal panacea, and also on an ideological level, it's kind of incoherent. Like for one of my things that could be considered more right wing is I'm a lot more hawkish on immigration. And for me, it's, somebody like Bernie Sanders up until 2015 was saying that open borders are a Koch brothers plot. And I was listening to one of your former guests, Angela Nagel, talk about this recently. And somebody like she or Malcolm Kiune are people that I found very influential, because you have they talk about the post-war consensus of the right and the left, that to the degree that they exist in the United States or Europe more broadly, like there are things that you're allowed to question and things that you're not allowed to question. I notice, broadly speaking, like if you want to be a leftist, pretty much anything goes as long as you don't question open borders forever. There's no such thing as a citizen anymore. You can, that's one of the few lines you can't color outside of. And more for the right, like you can't question the forever wars and the spreading of democracy. And to a degree, I'm seeing the MAGA movement break that mold. So, somebody like J.D. Vance is somebody that I'm more open to if he actually follows through on the ideology of, okay, reshoring would be good for America. It would be good long term, kind of for everybody if we had our own spheres of influence. And something like, again, immigration, mass immigration it's not good for the native populations for the most part. It's mostly not good for the people who immigrate because they're typically pretty economically exploited. It's really only good for the billionaire oligarchs who benefit from cheap labor. So that's something I'm hopeful for, and we're seeing politics that are a little bit more aligned with reality and people's material interests.
Yeah, I think multipolarity can work if it delivers returns to the elites comparable or larger than they would if they kept, doing whatever America's doing, kind of continuing in either the neoliberal or whatever, the new Trumpenreich offers um, mold. Because I think, the issue that you see with Russia, obviously it is its own pole in some ways, but it's very diminutive and compared to the US even now. China, obviously, extreme growth plateau and now racked with internal issues as well. Like all of these systems, um, you know, being someone who, I used to live in London and I studied abroad. I've been away for more than a decade. And then I came back to Romania. And obviously I had this idea that, people here are more community focused, you're more kind of organized around family, and they are up to the point of need. Um, Everyone wants prosperity. Everyone wants material goods. Everyone wants essentially freedom from their family if they can afford it. Everyone moves out of their family home. Like this whole multi-generational trad situation here is only contingent on poverty. If you have the money, you move away, which is, it's unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. There are situations where people make money, but then their relatives are still relatively in poverty, so they kind of become the central hub of money in the family, and then they move their relatives close to them just so they can. But in the case where you have your mother and father are also wealthy or relatively wealthy, so they can live separately, they will. So essentially, I'm thinking it really depends what's on offer. It really depends what the incentives are. And I think the US's position as global hegemon is quite more stable than you'd think. I mean, some things have eroded, but just looking at, 20 years ago, Romanian elections wouldn't follow a US pattern. We had our own problems. People were much more focused on local elections than they were on U.S. elections. And here, the more literate, you know, the more you speak English, the more sophisticated you are, the more plugged in you are into what's going on in America. So, people in the, rural people and, people are much more concerned with what's happening in the backyard because they don't have the prosperity. But English, America, the West is essentially kind of the city on the hill. People, that's where they want to go. And it's more the case of that than ever. It was just after communism, obviously, just the famous example of, people um, aspiring to what they had in the show Dallas, because for some reason they let people watch Dallas here. And essentially Dallas became kind of this brainwashing mechanism where people were like, this is how they live. Obviously, not everyone lives like in the show Dallas, but that seemed like an attainable situation. That guy wasn't like, JR wasn't the president. The people in the show were, obviously wealthy, but not, just it was incomprehensible how they lived. And now with social media and now with all this aspirational lifestyle stuff coming in from the US, that is the direction. Like you could see, I'm just looking at what businesses pop up here. It's, med spas, everyone's getting whatever, lip filler, stuff like that. This is, Eastern European version. Everything's a little bit too much. But anyway, it's all stuff that's coming in from the US, laser treatments, all these, activities, trampoline things for kids, like, inflatable balloons. People are doing gender reveal parties, like stuff like this. That's just like, so the
Mm-hmm.
culture is morphing slowly into a US shaped mold. And yeah, I think that's a type of soft power that I don't know. I don't know if they would, move to Bollywood if if the entertainment was a little bit better. It's so high status. It's so polished. It's so leagues ahead of everyone else in the possible multi-poles that it's pretty stable. I would think.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess that's a good point. And I don't think that, there's a lot of people who are very doomer and think, America's going to totally collapse. Either that or people have saying China, Russia, what have you, all this talk of collapse. I do think you're right. It's a lot more stable than people give it credit for. But that having been said, I do think like in the United States, it feels like there is a lack of will to try to project a coherent ideological message. Because I don't think anybody knows what it means to be America anymore. And that's something that we've been struggling with internally. We've had these different versions of what it means to be America that is, the more traditional historical version. And then we have that post World War II liberal version. And that seems like that's still what's popular. And I think we can still probably project that for a while. That having been said, I think with that lack of will, we're going to need to have something that's a little bit more ideologically coherent. Since I guess I'd be curious about the perspective, because I don't know what filters down to a country like Romania. It seems like American culture is still popular, but I don't know. Do you think if it's just the material thing, that if American culture, people talk a lot about the vibe shift. If that were to go through, would the aspirational wealth that people are seeking in Romania, would that be like the going back from say the Modern Family TV show of aspirational wealth, going back to Dallas? Is that possible, do you think, or is it just the wealth itself? Because when you talk about multi-generational homes in Romania being a function of poverty, I think that's something that we saw happen in the United States. People would live in multi-generational homes, and then America became more wealthy, but that's kind of collapsed. Like for the last 10 years, like most millennials and Gen Z, and they still live with their parents. So I don't know. I'd be curious to see how things actually shake down in the coming decades and years.
Yeah, yeah, I'm curious as well, though even the Gen Zers who live at home, I mean, aspirationally, they'd move out probably in a second if they had the
Yeah.
resources. So I guess it depends if Trumponomics works, if actually, they can manage to either build more or, reduce pressure on demand or something to stabilize home prices. But I don't think it's going to affect the kind of individualistic culture that's exported from the US. It might, but like you said, it's not often ideology that changes the face of a nation or a culture. It's, the ideology comes in to plug and to to lift the boats of the intellectuals trying to, talk about it. And I know a lot of political shifts are identified with the ideologues who were present at the time, but they were not the actual thing that moved it. There were, either ethnic tensions, material tensions, industrial revolutions, technological changes that made these people, that gave them the tools to actually become the court philosophers to whatever upheaval was happening at the time. So, I think it really, to not sound Marxist, it really depends on, in a way, the realpolitik of does this deliver? Does it set the right incentives for elites to follow? Yeah, I think that's going to be what it hinges on.
Yeah, well, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's really going to depend on if Trump and his successors in the MAGA movement can actually stick the landing. Because, as I said, I'm open-minded in the sense that if they're able to deliver on things that are important to me, sure, that's great. Because it feels like the older version of what was elite and what was considered high status in the U.S. is shifting. Like now, more and more, it used to be the cool cosmopolitan thing to, want to be a citizen of the world and always be moving. But more and more, I'm seeing a shift in American culture. And I think it's possibly partially because of the material side of it, where it's just not as edgy and glamorous to live like that anymore, and wanting to get a home and live a more traditional life, that might become the high status thing again. Because I think a lot of the times, I think kind of like you alluded to, a lot of this ideological stuff is a post hoc justification. So if they can actually stick the landing, that'll be great. But like you said, I could also see a backlash if this doesn't work. Because also I think, there's a lot of triumphalism about this Trump victory, and I don't want to underplay it, but at the same time, I think the margins were a lot more thin than people give it credit for. And just from what I've seen personally, I've known a lot of people in my personal life who were more liberal and then became more open to the MAGA ideology, and he's talk about prosperity and stuff like that. And if he's able to actually stick that, I think there's a pretty good chance. If you're following what's happening with Doge and the defunding of USAID and stuff like that, if it's successful, that'll be great. But if it, there's so many ways that it could go poorly, and if it does, I think it's going to be pretty bad for probably another generation.
Yeah, yeah. So I think fingers crossed for our friends in high places. So I think another thing that I wanted to discuss with you, you have a really interesting, I think a few pieces that discuss, the idea of masculinity, of being a man, nowadays, which is a strange place to be. I completely admit it, even from my, vantage point. But yeah, I think you describe some tensions. And I really love the metaphor that you used about, the choice in masculinities nowadays is essentially between cocaine and heroin. And maybe you could speak a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So that's from a piece that I wrote called "On the Masculine Urge to Die in a Suicidal Cavalry Charge," which basically, like, the idea behind that, like, if you think about, there are these famous instances in either history or literature, like Custer's Last Charge or something like that, or the example I used, like in Lord of the Rings, like, you and all the guys get together and, you're charging at the orcs, and that's, the ultimate death for a man, like, ideally. And in that piece, I kind of talked about how in my early life, I was more culturally on the left, where I guess you could say, yeah, like, to be traditionally masculine was kind of low status. And I wasn't, I never exactly identified with, like, the complete, subversion of it, Bugman angle, but it's like, oh, this is kind of antiquated. It's not the way I want to live the world anymore. But as I got older and started living in the world more, it's, it's not something you can really check out of. And I saw a lot of people who would either do the complete subversion of it and, like, the stereotype of the soy boy / bug man, where, you spend all your time actively shitting on and denigrating classic masculinity. That's, the heroine in that metaphor, because you just kind of lull yourself to sleep. You check out with video games, porn, consumerism, etc. Or you could do the more traditional masculinity, and that can be a little bit more like cocaine or an upper, because it's something that's very empowering, gives you a lot of strength, but it can also be pretty damaging to you as an individual. And that's something I wrote about. I ended up having, a heart attack / panic attack at the age of 30, just because I was overworking myself so much. And that's been kind of something that I've been working on, both my personal life and my writing, to try to find a good middle ground between those two things. Because on one level, yes, it's true, there are, call it toxic masculinity, whatever you want to talk, terminology you want to use for it. It can be something that's damaging to you, and you can be used and abused because of it. But it's also something that can give you power and an identity and meaning in life. And, the more I try to take responsibility in my life and take charge, the better I feel. But at the same time, it can have a negative effect. So trying to have a balance between those two poles is something I try to aim for, and something that I've written about.
Yeah, I've read an essay recently on Substack, something about the soy right. I don't know if you've encountered this one.
Yeah.
It's essentially the right-wing Bugman. It's a kind of a sub-faction of the current ascendant right, where you described it, essentially people who are hooked on heroin, but also on right-wing rage bait, where it's the inertness, the inactivity is justified because the world is not right wing enough. You can't do things. Nothing is possible until the specific Reich will be
Mhm.
instantiated, and then possibilities will open up. And I think that's kind of a similar archetype. But yeah, obviously I've encountered this specimen in the wild, and um, I do understand why people are kind of locked into that, because people have less and less experience with the real world. Like you said, you had your phase in the real world, and it teaches you things that it's just you can't derive from just consuming information or media or others' depictions of how life is. And then obviously these are emphasized for they're fictionalized, made more interesting. Even the most accurate fictionalization of reality is never going to compare to the real thing. So I think a lot of men really do lack that exposure to it, and in a way, you have men who, in almost kind of evolutionary terms, were built for war in a world where, the only war you have is online, or, there's not really any battlefield that you can go in with your brothers, or, if you really want to, it can be engineered, and I'm sure the Republican Party, especially the old style Republican Party, will manage to get you in a theater of war somewhere. But yeah, it's a strain. It's like a machine that was built for a specific purpose being thrown into a world where, that's just not needed anymore. I mean, can you have heroism without war?
I would say so. And it's funny you say that because remember, I've been in the online spaces enough where I see like um, the I've seen it switch back and forth again between like there's a certain type of guy who's always down and out, call it incel, whatever you want to call it. And I remember when I first got online in the early 2010s, it was like vaguely liberal leaning of like, oh, the conservatives, they want to censor our video games. And if we could just get rid of that. And that's, you mentioned the era of new atheism. And it was always, oh, if we could just get rid of the Christian conservatives who were, society is so illogical because of religion, or, oh, the Muslims. And then it became, as time went on, like, more, oh, well, it's these, the capitalists and, what have you. And now it's again, the deep state. That's the reason I can't get a girlfriend. Right. And in my personal life, that's not been something that tempted me. I've always been, for better or worse, the type of guy that I'll just throw myself into things and try to figure it out as I go. But as far as finding masculine meaning, because then again, like I think there is something to some of the criticism of traditional gender roles, because like you mentioned, it's something that it's a good instinct that can be subverted and used for unscrupulous reasons. And that, has obviously knock-on bad effects. But at the same time, like, I don't think that, gender is just a complete social construct. We're blank slates that, you can put any software on. And I think men in particular really have that need for meaning and some sort of challenge. I mean, not that women don't, but it's like you said, it's something that is either hardwired in us by evolution or God, depending on how you look at it. And for me, I think because again, like, I talked about, the example of Lord of the Rings. Everybody, you want to be Aragorn, who you're swinging your sword, you're riding down the mountain to slay all the orcs. But I think maybe the more realistic version of heroism that we can have as men is more like, Frodo or Sam. Like, our lives are not necessarily going to be, God willing, World War III fighting against the Hun or whoever. But there is a lot of evil and a lot of bad things in the world that need to be confronted. And it's not as sexy, but to actually live in the world and not completely check out and just, oh, it's too bad. The deep state has already won, the capitalist, whatever you want to call it. And it's easy to just like, completely throw up your hands and not engage, but to willingly engage with it and do the difficult work of the less sexy changes that need to be done. and, maybe being a father, being a husband, or, being a participant or a leader in your community. I think these are the things that are going to give people meaning, because I'll say, on that note, like there was a time where I would go to DSA meetings, like, for people who haven't heard of it, Democratic Socialist of America. And for the most part, it is every bit as cringe as, everybody's seen those videos of, people
Point
just
of
yelling
personal
about
privilege.
and pronouns and stuff like that. There was some legitimate organization that tried to go behind it. And that's what I found frustrating. It's like, okay, this is during COVID. Let's try to, do some volunteer work to get some people food. And after I quit that, during COVID, I ended up volunteering at a church. And it was just like that we would work with like local grocery stores to like have them donate food, and we'd give it out to the community. And I got way more fulfillment out of that than I ever got out of, theory selling and talking about every, the perfect theory. If we could just, get rid of the capitalists, at the end of the day, people had food where they would not have before. And I had some people in my life who are still in that world. It's like, oh, well, they're from a church. They might've been homophobic or transphobic or racist. And it's like, well, that didn't really come up. They didn't have food, and then they did have food because of what I and the people that I was working with were doing. I'm not personally religious myself at this moment, but I think that's the type of thing that we're going to need more and more, especially as we're entering difficult times.
Yeah, I think it's I think a lot of people who like to listen to political commentary, or like to engage in political commentary, like to be part of politics as it unfolds, or at least like to think they are, kind of chafe at this idea that sometimes it's wise for whatever purpose to step away from politics and to engage with things at a more like at a less sexy level, because it is like, okay, you're kind of subverting the movement by not being a voice in it. You're drawing away your vital energy just at the moment. We're just at the precipice. We're gonna win, and
2 more
now,
weeks.
yeah, exactly. There's always 2 more weeks until the final version of what we need to do is going to come to fruition. So I think that's a challenge for many, and it's been a challenge for me as well, because I've kind of gone off politics a little bit, because number one, I think pretty much everything that could be said about subversive right-wing politics has been said on my podcast. I have really no idea where, what other edgy angle to take. And if I branch out even more, I think, it's going to be cranks morning, noon, and night. There's just not much else to say. I think the core of it is unqualified reservations. Maybe read, the Dark Enlightenment, read the books that Moldbug recommends. I guess that's pretty much your education in it. And then obviously you can go into whatever South African studies, and get really HBD pilled and all this type of stuff. But yeah, I mean, there's an end to it. You can ingest a limited number of red pills until they turn black, until they turn multicolored, and you're just off the deep end. So yeah, I think hopefully a lot of people are having this kind of awakening where, in the end, after all is said and done, after all of the theory has been imbibed, probably most likely the best thing that you can do is to actually go out and just do things. I know it sucks, but that's pretty much it.
Yeah, it's really a difficult business to be in. I'm glad I just do this as a hobby, because at the end of the day, like, it sounds like you're in a similar place. Like, at the end of the day, you've got to touch the grass. You can only read so much theory. You can only take so many pills before it just starts to become an end to its own. And, don't get me wrong, I do enjoy it. That's why I do this. I just started writing kind of on a whim, believe it or not. When I first started writing in Substack last year, that was the first time I've ever really written before. So there is definitely something to it. And it feels, especially if you're somebody who's politically minded or, socially conscious, you want to feel like you're having an effect on it. But sometimes it's like, since I know you have kids, I don't know if you or your husband has ever done this. Like, you just want a little bit of time to yourself. you start playing video games, you give them a controller that's unplugged, and they feel like they're playing that game because they don't really understand how it works yet. And like, they're very invested when they win. They're very sad when they die. But as soon as they get old enough to notice, oh, wait a second, me pressing the A button doesn't actually correlate to what's happening on the screen, they start to check out. And that's what I see with a lot of people in the process of, you take enough, like you said, take enough red pills, and then eventually, you're going to get black pilled because you're not seeing the connection between the input and the output of what you're doing. And eventually you have to do something, even if you look at it from, a left-wing angle or a right-wing angle, like, use, French Revolution or Russian Revolution for a left side. These are people who actually did something at the end of the day. Or if you're looking at the right-wing side, and you're looking at like the elite theory, the best way, to actually be able to affect things is to get competent in your real life, be involved in the real world, and be the type of person that people will call on when things get bad. Because if you read your history, and you go far back enough, like, somebody like, Curtis Yarvin will talk about a counter-elite and a neo-nobility. Somebody like Burnham will talk about that too. If you look at history and nobility as a concept, if you go far back enough, that was just somebody who could, thought, but like, hey, we have a little bit of extra grain this year. Maybe we should save it for the winter. Or somebody who, when the barbarians come, can, organize some men, sharpen some sticks, and keep them from taking, your cows and your daughters. So to me, that is the ultimate. If, I have, a couple political projects, that would be the ultimate one to, give people, myself included, enough framing to make sense of the world so you can live in the world and be ready when, shit hits the fan, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think this perception, I think you're very right, is very sharpened once you have kids. Like your competence within the world and your ability to solve problems and your ability to shield your kids from whatever, new flavor of apocalypse is looming, becomes very serious. I mean, I'm not a prepper, but I'm just, I've become much more acutely aware that I am responsible and that I have to show leadership in my own family. Like I can't not be of the world, So it's I guess, have kids. It's one way of solving this problem. And it just, it plugs you into realpolitik a little bit more. Like you really are much more interested in stuff that really directly affects you. It's much harder to just be ideological about politics because when you're cutting corners, you're not just cutting them on yourself. When you're making concessions, you're not making concessions just for yourself. You're making concessions for, your children and their future and all that type of stuff. So it's, the complex theories about, what's going to happen. We just need a little civil war. It's like, no. I really prefer we skip the civil war. We just try to, keep steady state in some way. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's things become much less edgy. You're itching for much less, maybe it also comes with age, but still it's, the spicy history is something that you start wanting to avoid.
Yeah, actually being involved in the world will, like you say, you can only take so many red pills if you have to live in the world. One of my, I call it, my I have to work in the morning test. Like, okay, you could, be it Moldbug or Lenin or whoever, these revolutionary politics. Like, okay, that all sounds great, but I have to work in the morning. How is this actually going to affect my real life and the people around me? And, be it having kids, I don't have kids yet. I plan to in the next couple years, or even just, being involved with your community, your neighbors. Maybe you're not the type of person who wants to have kids or it's not possible for you, but you could be a good aunt or uncle or, as things get more difficult, taking care of your parents, whatever it is, like actually dealing with the real world is more important. Because I'm somebody who is of the belief that I think your politics, however you want to phrase it, or something that's innate to you that you can kind of intuitively tell what your interests are. And a lot of the times I think people will work backwards and come up with some kind of ideological or philosophical framing to, give legitimacy to their worldview, because it's, something that's maybe changing a little bit, but just the naked will to power of, that Schmittian friend-enemy distinction of, me and people like me are good, and people who are not me and or not like me are bad. It's, I guess it's probably at the core of most ideologies, but it's not something that you can really win with. So actually being engaged with the real world, you'll be able to tell what your politics actually are and what your interests actually are, and you can avoid some of these super esoteric political or philosophical worldviews that, I mean, don't get me wrong, they're fun. If you look at my bookshelf, I'll have Evola, and also, somebody like Lenin or Slavoj Žižek, just because I'm a curious person and I want to know what they said. But a lot of these times, these writers are writing to a very specific time, in a very specific place, and very specific material conditions. You might be able to glean some wisdom from that, but realistically, it's not going to be applicable in a one-to-one sense for the modern moment, or whatever what your material conditions are and where you live.
Yeah, I mean, it's people really love to talk about principles, but every time you peel the layers back, it's essentially a cover for something much more, a cloak for will to power, in one way or another. Okay, well, we are coming up on time, and I want to ask you the last question, the question of the show. Do you have someone that you like to recommend, a thinker, maybe someone who's a bit underrated that you think people should check out?
Yeah, I've given this a lot of thought because I've listened to a fair amount of the episodes of your show. And I feel like the majority of the people that I would recommend have already been recommended. Somebody like Peter Turchin, I think, is very salient. But I think if I had to pick one that I don't believe has been picked yet, I would say R.R. Reno, specifically his book, The Return of the Strong Gods, which talks about the return of populism and nationalism. And he has a way that's very sober of looking at the history of why these movements went away and why they're returning, and coming up with a positive way that incorporates the good of modernity and progressivism, while also maintaining, this is not a dog that hunts anymore, and this is something that's going to happen, and here's a way forward that's positive.
Oh, that's interesting. This is the First Things editor, I think. No, Rusty Reno? Or, yeah, possibly.
R.R. Reno, I don't know the whole name.
Yeah, I'll check it out. Yeah, it hasn't been recommended, but yeah, I'll have a look and maybe get him on the podcast.
That'd be awesome.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. This has been amazing. Please let people know where they can read your stuff.
Sure. You can find me at substack.com. That's the only place I'm really at right now. It's Prester John Andrews, and I write dispatches from the Golden Horde, and my podcast is the Xanadu Review, and that comes out every other Monday.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This has been lovely.
Thank you, Alex. You have a great day.
If you like this conversation, please consider becoming a member of my Substack community at alexkashuta.com or on patreon.com/aksubversive, where you'll find the audio version of all the podcasts I've recorded. And if you are so inclined, please do like, subscribe, comment, or review the podcast. It helps very much. Thank you, and see you next week.